Residents' rights. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, hopefully, because there are other provisions in relation to rights which we're going to come to later on. And I'm only talking here about rights in respect of corporate governance, so in respect of companies, rather than rights arising out of other statutory rights you have, or RICS, which we're going to talk about a lot more. Chris is going to talk about a lot more in detail later. If you are a member or shareholder in the management company, then you have rights to attend and participate in the annual general meeting. Now, I know you talked about AGMs quite a lot last time. Some company structures do not require an annual general meeting to be held, but the shareholders or members in the company may amend the articles by a written resolution with 75% of the shareholders' support. So you have a corporate remedy there. If it doesn't require, if your company that you're a member of does not require an AGM, and you know that there's a need for communication for opening things up, then if 75% of the shareholders get together and agree that, you can change the articles of the company. And that applies to other changes in the articles of the company as well. If you get 75% of the people to agree, you can change that. If the articles do require an AGM, but the directors aren't holding one, then 50% of the shareholders can request that the directors hold an AGM, so you can have it. And then they must have a meeting within 21 days.
There,
sorry,
50, not 5.
50. Sorry, 50%. Sorry, 50% of the shareholders can require that the directors hold an AGM. Sorry, that's my bad typing there. Right, that's sort of all I want to say about corporate governance there, because it is, corporate law is a massive, massive topic, and I suppose one of the things, we already talked about the complexities of leases, but also the complexities of company law that you have to come into contact with, mean that it becomes very, very complicated. Just very, do you want me to cover this very quickly now? Or do you want, yeah, okay. So, residents' rights. You've got various statutory rights in respect of, this is a lovely old word, isn't it? Enfranchisement. That means getting a better interest in your building than you have already, and lease extensions. We're not going to cover this in great detail. Most of you live in blocks where you've still got quite a long time on your leases. But as time goes by and you think, well, actually, my lease was for 125 years, but it was granted 35 years ago, and there's a lot less time left on my lease, you are entitled to apply for a lease extension. You have a statutory right to apply for a lease extension. There are certain qualifying requirements for that, the main one being that you've lived in the property for 2 years. You tend to find, this is very common in London. We deal with a lot of transactions in London where the leases were granted in the 1970s. They're now perhaps not as long and therefore not as attractive to lenders as they were. The seller is asked to serve a notice on their landlord requiring a lease extension. Then they assign the benefit of that right to their buyer, who will take forward the lease extension application. You have to pay your landlord for getting a longer lease, but you get an extra 90 years. So 90 years is added to your lease term. Obviously, it depends where the flat is, because there's a very complicated method of calculation of the value of the lease. But in the long run, it's worth it. So you've got a statutory right to a lease extension. There are various rights surrounding enfranchisement. There's two aspects to this. The legislation doesn't fit together frightfully well, so there are subtle differences between it. If your freeholder wants to sell their freehold, and subject to certain exceptions, there is a statutory right. They have to serve a notice on you, the residents in the flat, and if 50% of the qualifying tenants come back and say, we would like to get together, form a company and buy the freehold, you are entitled to do so. You have to pay a price. The landlord must, if the landlord sells without serving a notice on you, you may then go against the buyer and insist that they sell the property to you for the price that they paid. Now, there are certain exemptions and exclusions to that, and it's probably the worst drafted legislation that we ever come across in relation to leasehold rights. And there are quite a lot of exceptions. So it's, if you were to say to me, well, I found out that the freehold's changed hands and we never got a notice, that may be because it was transferred to a company that was part of the same group as your landlord, or there are other exceptions, or there are other layers of leases between you and the landlord. But that is quite a significant right. There's also rights for what are called collective enfranchisement. So the residents can get together and ask the landlord to sell them the freehold of their building. Again, there are quite a lot of hurdles to get over, and you have to all know as participants that you will be able to pay the price. We had an interesting conversation with a group of residents only a few weeks ago, where they'd had quite a lot of advice. The application, they had enough tenants who wanted to participate. It was quite a small block, only 6 flats, so it was easy for them all to talk to each other. And they got advice about the value of the property, and they made their offer and they said the price they were prepared to pay, and the landlord has come back and asked for the price that they want, and it will end up going to the first tier property tribunal ultimately for a decision about what the correct price is. But the residents said, well, we hadn't thought it might be more money, even though they'd been told that it might be more money, and they're now panicking about whether they can afford to go ahead. So you do have to be very certain, and you do have to all be very sure that you're agreeing together, because you're all agreeing to spend quite a significant amount of money. But you do have those rights. You've got various remedies in respect of service charge. We're not going to go into loads of detail now about purely the formalities of the way in which the service charge must be demanded, but you must have explanations. Your lease will also say things about the accounts that have to be produced, when they have to be produced. We're also going to look in quite a lot of detail at the RICS Code of Practice as to what is specific. You also have rights to go to the first tier property tribunal if the service charge is not reasonable, and they have very wide powers to investigate and set service charges. And obviously you've got whatever the terms of your lease are, and it's always the first starting point. What does my lease say as far as that's concerned? And what do other people's leases say if my problem is actually with somebody else in the block? Right, so...
Okay, let's have some clarifications on that session. Residents' rights.
Yes.
Man Island has recently had a situation where we were notified the freehold had been sold after the fact. Now, I appreciate you probably can't go into details about this and give us legal advice.
I can give you some advice about it. That not all the flats have been sold in Man Island, have they?
Correct.
If less than 50% of the flats have been sold, they can sell the freehold without giving you the option to buy. Or if less than 50% of the flats are held by qualifying tenants. Now, by part of this calculation, and this comes up a lot at the moment, if somebody owns 3 or more flats in a block, they are not a qualifying tenant. So let us say you've got 50 flats in the block and 30 have been sold. You would say, well, more than 50% of the flats are held by qualifying tenants, they've been sold. However, If 15 of those flats are owned by 2 companies, you've only got 15 flats in the building held by qualifying tenants, and therefore the landlord wouldn't need to serve the option notices under the Act. The other circumstance that can arise is if the freehold is transferred to a company that's been associated with the freeholder for 2 years. This is the most common one. This is what I would do if a freeholder came to me and said, I want to dispose of the freehold and I don't want to offer it to the residents. I would say to them, and if they were a developer, the likelihood is, I'd say, have you got a dormant company in your group that's doing nothing, that is an associated company owned or controlled, a subsidiary of your company? And they say yes, and you say, okay, transfer the freehold to that company, now sell the company. And you've disposed of your interest without having to serve the notice.
How do we as a residents association go about finding out whether the new freeholder was a subsidiary or associate?
Well, you can check it out with the company, but you can also serve a notice on them. Now the other thing is, of course, they may have entered into a contract to sell it before they sold any of the flats, and that would also get round it. You get this quite a lot in developments. So the developer builds the development, but before they sell any of the flats, they know they want to sell the freehold. So they enter into a contract with another company that says, once we've sold X number of flats, or the last flat in the building, we will we will complete that contract, we'll transfer it, and again, that gets round it. Although, on the whole, when I've had that scenario, we've always been very open with the buyers that that's what was going to happen. And quite often, the contract is on the freeholders register. There's a note of it so that everybody knows about it. It's not, we don't regard that as something to be kept secret. You do have statutory rights to serve a notice on the freeholder requesting the details of the transaction. And you can do that. So all you got was a notice of the change. The other thing, of course, is that they would sometimes in that situation serve the notice anyway, because not all the flats are being sold, so the price is so high, they just take the risk that nobody's going to reply.
We had the same thing at City Quay. We were informed about a year ago that the freeholder had changed and sold the freehold, and when we inquired about it, it was because the freehold was sold as a package of freeholds that were all held by one company that were being transferred to another company, and that the freehold for our building was not being sold individually, but it was a business that was being sold to another business. Yeah. I mean, it is an incredibly complicated area, and I also have to say that although the seller has committed, if they haven't served the notice, the seller has committed a criminal offence, but a lot of buyers would just think, and as far as I know, there's never been a prosecution. But the risk to the buyer is that the residents will say this sale shouldn't have happened and we are entitled to acquire on the same terms. But sometimes the terms are so complicated that they're very unattractive to a group of residents, particularly if it's forced because of bank debt or an insolvency of one of the companies, or, it actually might not be something that you really want to buy. So it is a very difficult one. And the other area that causes enormous problems, which we'll talk a bit more about in mixed-use developments, is where you have a mixed-use development. Technically, if you've got a mixed-use development which has got flats, let's take, for example, one with flats above and shops below, and the freeholder just owns the reversion of everything, so they own the freehold interest that lies above your lease of flats, and then they just receive the rent in respect of the shops downstairs. technically speaking, because the legislation is very badly drafted, when their tenant's lease comes to an end and they have to grant a new lease, they should write to all of you and say, we are proposing to do this, would you, the tenants, like to take the lease? That's ridiculous, isn't it? That's what the legislation says. And if you were to turn around and say, well, yes, actually, we would, because what we'd like to see in our block is we don't really want to have that shop down there. What we'd much rather have is some sort of community facility. So we'd like to take that lease and we'll take it on that rent and we'd be more than happy to do so. Where does that leave the landlord? Their tenant has a statutory right to a new tenancy of that shop.